Hello, algebra classes. We are going to take a look at our samples for lesson 10.4, where we're making stem and leaf plots and histograms so that we can have a visual understanding of the data and what kinds of patterns or trends we might notice in that data. So our first sample is making a stem and leaf plot, and we're going to make sure we include a key. That's super important for our stem and leaf plots. Without a key, our data display is meaningless. So even if you're not told that you need a key for a stem and leaf plot, you must include one. You've been reminded, so let's make sure that we include it. All right, so we've gathered some data. We went to a coffee shop, and we found out the number of steps taken by employees working behind a counter in that coffee shop during a 5-minute period of time. So this is how many steps each of those employees took. My first task will be to get all of those data points lined up smallest to biggest, least to greatest. So the person who took the fewest number of steps was 12 in those 5 minutes. They were standing relatively still. And then at the far other end of the data, we have a person who took 68 steps. So most of them are not doing a lot of walking behind the bar, but a few of them are taking a few more steps than others. So let's see what that looks like in a stem and leaf plot. So once we have them all lined up from smallest to biggest, and again, the technique that I used to make sure that I included all the data and I didn't forget any, each time I wrote down my smallest number and then the next smallest number and then the next smallest number and so forth. I put a little yellow dot above it in my initial list just to make sure that I got them all. And if I made any mistakes, that I could get them in the correct location before it became a crisis at the end where I didn't know where to put the numbers. Okay, so here's my list. So I'm going to decide for this data set, it is my choice, I'm going to decide on my stems. I'm going to make my stems 10s, and I'm going to make my leaves 1s. It is a choice how you set it up. These could be numbers 1.2, 2.3, 2.3, 3.4, and so forth. If that were the case, we still could use the stems and leaves the way you see it, but we would have to say in our key that any one of those numbers has a decimal point between the stem and the leaf. Okay, so for my stems, again, I'm using 10s, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, and my leaves, I'm using 1s. The leaves must go in order from smallest to biggest. And so I'm going to start by putting in 12, so 10 plus 2 is 12. And here's my 20s, 23, 23, I have that twice, 34, 35. There are no 40s. Notice there is no data in the 40s. The stem of 4 must be included to keep the intervals the same, so we can't skip it. We can't go from 3 to 5, because that would make the interval from 3 to 5 different than from 2 to 3. So we have to include 4. But there are no leaves next to the stem of 4 because there are no numbers in the list of data that are in the 40s. So that just remains blank. No 40s. And then we have 54, 57, 59, 60, 61, 64, and 68. So these leaves must go smallest to biggest as well. And here's my key. I chose to use the number 34. You can choose any number that you want off your stem and leaf plot and define it, but the key is crucial. All right, that's all for our stem and leaf plot. Now we're going to make a histogram of some data, and the data happens to represent ages of 13 people. Maybe they're in a room together. We're doing a study of those people and how old they are. I've asked you to use intervals of 10, from 0 to 9, 10 to 19, 20 to 29, etc. You actually are free to choose your intervals unless you're given specific ones. You could have done intervals of 5 or 3 or 20, but for convenience I chose intervals of 10 because it looked like for this data, where I have the youngest person at age 15 and the oldest person at 59, those intervals of 10 would be good choices. It kind of spreads out my data a little bit so I can see where is my group of people populating the age group the most. So the first thing, I took all of these ages, I put them in order from least to greatest, 15 at the youngest, 59 at the oldest. And then I said, okay, where are my groups of 10? So here's my 10s, 20s, 30s, 40s, a lot of people in their 40s, and 50s. So I set up my data display, my histogram. Up the side will be the frequency, how often those people's ages show up, how many are in their 40s, how many are there in their 20s. And I knew to make 5 marks because my highest frequency is my number of people in 40s, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 people in their 40s. So that determined my highest mark here. I needed to go up by 1s up to 5 to include my highest bar. And then I set my intervals down here on the bottom, and I'm labeling what this axis is. I need labels, otherwise, again, this is meaningless information. So across the bottom, people's ages, starting at age 0 up to 9, there is no bar there because there was nobody who was between the ages 0 and 9. So my bars begin here, and I had one person in their teens, 2 people in their 20s, 2 people in their 30s, and then this is my highest number of people in their 40s, and then I had 3 people in their 50s. So this is a little bit older group. We can see at a glance, looking at that histogram, that we have significantly more middle-aged people than we have younger people, or even at the oldest end of the spectrum here. All right, so that's it for our samples on lesson 10.4. It's time for you to move on to the quiz portion of this lesson. We'll see you next time.